最重要的双边关系。中美两国如何相处，决定人类的命运和前途。这里我想用3个关键词来开启我们今天的讨论。第一个词呢是开放态度，就是我们中华文明绵延不断5000年，始终坚持与时俱进、兼收并蓄、合作交流的和平理念。对于中美双方的互动交流，我们作为中华民族始终保持真诚的一个开放态度。第2个关键词呢是正确认知。那么无论是美国的政府官员，还是国会议员，亦或是民间人士，来中国实地感受中国的历史文化，亲眼看看中国现在的发展状况，切身感受中国的发展道路，将有助于形成正确的对话认知。只有彼此了解，人与人才能正确相处。那么我想中美之间也是这样。第3个关键词是具体行动。那么无论是访问互动还是对话交流，都是中美双方相向而行的积极举动，是落实中美两国元首巴厘岛会晤重要共识的一个具体行动。推动中美两国关系稳定和改善，需要我们积极的从一件一件具体的事情做起，不断积蓄相向而行的动力和势能，为中美关系尽快稳下来、好起来注入积极的因素。那我先讲到这里，谢谢大家。Now, probably we can invite Mr. Orlins to make a few opening remarks, and then we'll have a discussion. Yeah, please.
Okay. 所以要我用英文讲话吗？要用中文讲话？都差不多了，都差不多了。就是我在香港待了那么多年，可是我不会广东话。这个我到港大来，我还记得我第一次来，你知道是哪一年？1972年，我就来了。那个时候我在台湾在读书，所以我就夏天来这看一看。But I want to thank the Research Hub on Institutions in China for inviting me. It's terrific.
Can you switch on the microphone?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
现在好一点吗？
好。
要不要我重新开始？
可以。
不需要了。So I was just reflecting on when I first came here in 1972. First came to Hong Kong University. I was a student at Taiwan Shifan Daxue, studying Mandarin. So I came here, and I still remember one of the vivid memories is there was no air conditioning. So it was really, really, really hot in August. And of course, there was no air conditioning at Shifan Daxue either, so I was really hot in Taiwan. So it forced me to study all the time, which was good, which is why my Mandarin is 差不多了，可以了，问题不大。I always, I've lived in Hong Kong for about 10 years, since 1979. I lived here both during the colonial era and then after the handover, after the return of Hong Kong to China. So I've experienced both. My careers here, I was first working for a law firm, an American law firm in Hong Kong. Then I was working for the late, great Lehman Brothers, where I was president of Lehman Brothers Asia. And then, and we were the first tenant at Pacific Place. So on August 8, 1988, 8月8号1988年, we moved in. But it didn't save Lehman Brothers. After many years, it went gone. But I was long gone, and then I moved back here right after the handover in 1998 for the Carlyle Group, and lived here for a number of years. And then in 2005, became president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, where I strongly believe I have given back to the American people and the Chinese people in terms of what I'm doing. I always say, my current work is Wei Ren Min Fu, it's to serve the people. So the people, they say, who do you represent? 你代表谁? Well, I represent the American people. I don't necessarily represent American business, don't necessarily represent the American government, though the American government funds the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations in part. So some of our funding comes from the United States State Department, most comes from United States foundations, corporations, and individuals. just a word on U.S.-China relations and then a word kind of on Hong Kong. Because I was in business for all those years, I used to always be used to doing quarterly reports. So those in media are used to kind of businesses giving a quarterly outlook. And one of the things that you learned in business, if you had a really bad quarter, the next quarter was easy to be good because you had a very low base. U.S.-China relations have been really bad for a long time. They have created problems for the American people, for the Chinese people, for the world. What has happened over the last 6 months is we've seen an improvement in U.S.-China relations. So it was kind of like people say, well, it's easy to improve because they were so bad. And there is truth to that, that prior to April 10th of this year, U.S.-China relations were in enormous difficulty. On April 10th and April 11th, in Vienna, Austria, Wang Yi and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met, and they spent, I believe it was 13 hours in meetings over 2 days. And what they were able to do was set a framework for U.S.-China relations going forward. And what is quite good is the framework has actually been implemented. So what happened immediately after that meeting was Wang Wentao, the Minister of Commerce, was in the United States for an APEC preparatory meeting, and he went to Washington and he met with Secretary Raimondo. Then we had Secretary Blinken come to China, and he met with not only Wang Yi, but met with Xi Jinping. Then we've had Secretary Yellen come. Then we've had Secretary Raimondo come. Then we've had Special Envoy Kerry come. We've had the creation of economic working groups, financial services working groups. We've had more discussions of Chinese officials going to the United States. You know, we're hopeful Wang Yi will be going to the United States soon. We're hopeful that when the APEC meeting occurs in November, that the President of China and the President of the United States get time together. So as Professor Yen mentioned, the Bali Accords, they met in Bali, but they haven't met since Bali. So if they can meet next month on the sidelines of APEC, that will be good. So what we're seeing an increase in flights between China and the United States. We're seeing improvements in visa issuance. We've seen, as I said, the creation of working groups. So what we're beginning to see is a gradual improvement because it was so difficult before April 10th. So in many ways you say, well, it's not that hard to improve because it was at such a low base. But it's really important that we've begun to start talking. What it means for Hong Kong is Hong Kong has been caught in the middle of this deterioration. So to the extent that U.S.-China relations improves, Hong Kong will benefit from that improvement. It will benefit economically, and it will benefit politically. So what the Hong Kong government should be doing is thinking about how in this slightly improved atmosphere, Hong Kong's relations with the United States can improve. Having said all of that, I cannot tell you what will happen in 2024. I'm pretty confident about 2023. I am concerned that we'll see further deterioration in 2024. We, of course, have elections in Taiwan early next year, which can create some disruptions. We have elections in the United States, and in the process of the U.S. elections, the American public is extremely negative on China. So if you look at recent polling, it suggests that 82%, 82%, of Americans have a negative attitude towards China. What that means to a politician in the United States is, this is public, how do I say this? There's not a ton of benefit that accrues to a politician for doing something constructive with China, because the American people see the Chinese government very negatively. So it's incumbent in the short term for both governments to enter into agreements which substantively improve the lives of the people of the United States and the lives of the people of China. And there are lots of things that can be done in the short term which can do that. Which, in other words, you don't, if you're an American politician, you cut tariffs, let's say. The tariffs are cut. Well, the American people immediately benefit from the reduction in costs that come from those reduced tariffs. So maybe you can get something like improved visa issuance. People benefit immediately. So in the tariff case, the people of China also benefit. Initiatives on climate change. You know, we've seen the hottest summer on record. So if you can have joint initiatives on climate change, China's obviously very focused on renewable energy, so cooperation in renewable energy. The pandemic remains on everyone's mind. Cooperation in joint initiatives on pandemic prevention has immediate benefits for both the American and Chinese people. And then, most importantly, you know, the people-to-people exchanges have immediate benefits. So if you're a student at Gangda and you want to do further work in the United States, it's important that you be able to do that and conduct your research. And it's important that American students, that there's slight reduction in Chinese students going to the United States. There's an enormous reduction in American students coming to China. So I strongly advocate they should come, whether it's to Gangda, whether it's to universities on the mainland that happen. So there are a lot of kind of specific things that the government can do, that both governments can do during this period. But, you know, Hong Kong has a critical role to play in the middle of this. That it has, since I arrived here in 1972, always been a place where there is intermediation between China and the United States, and Hong Kong must continue to play that role.
Thank you, Mr. Orlins. So probably we can now start our discussion on a few issues.
Sure.
Yeah, so probably I will begin with a question about your personal experience from a young diplomat involved in the establishment of diplomatic relationship between China and the United States in the 1970s, to the president of the National Committee on United States-China Relations over the past 18 years. You have been very familiar with China for over 40 years as an old friend. So, and you're one of the few Americans who have personally witnessed the starting point as well as the stepwise development of China-U.S. relationship. So what are your views on the China-U.S. relationship at present? So what is the next step, or what is the next constructive step for the China-U.S. relationship?
Well, I hope, the next step is a visit by the President of China to the United States and meetings between the President of China and the President of the United States. I also hope that now that we have, both governments have recognized we need to talk. That if we don't talk, we're just going to get a deterioration in the relationship. So my hope is we can set up a mechanism which has regular meetings between the two presidents. That, it's the two most important countries in the world. It's the most important bilateral relationship in the world. Everyone basically recognizes that. So what we need to do is, in the context of that, we need to have a regular mechanism, not because there's an APEC meeting, not because there's a G20 meeting. We need to just set up some way for the President of China and the President of the United States to speak regularly. It should be in person, but if it can't be in person, then let it be by Zoom. But we should not allow 3 months to go by without some way of having them talking. Because the reality is, it's hard for bureaucracies as big as both the American bureaucracy and the Chinese bureaucracy to make progress without hearing from the top that you need to do the following things. So back when I was, in the State Department, as you said, in the 70s, and we were establishing diplomatic relations, we had to hear from President Carter as to what we should do. And I'm sure the Chinese bureaucracy had to hear from Deng Xiaoping. And I still, one of the vivid memories, I was, so young. I mean, it's funny, when you're young, you don't quite understand that you're working on something that is historic. You're just too young. You don't, I was 28 years old. I didn't know how important what I was doing was. And I still remember, so Deng, we established diplomatic relations December 15th. We announced the establishment December 15th, 1978. The establishment is effective January 1, 1979. And then Deng Xiaoping, I get the notice, I'm just, what I always say, I'm a xiao tu dou. I'm just a little potato. And we get the notice that Deng Xiaoping is going to come and visit the United States. And again, I'm just a xiao tu dou, but the White House says, because you worked on the establishment of diplomatic relations, you can come and be in the greeting party for Deng Xiaoping. And I go, oh, okay, that works. So, it's a cold, sunny day. And, again, I don't understand the historic. In retrospect, I understand, but nobody was teaching me history as I was in the State Department saying, this is historic. And we go to the, we go to the White House, and of course it's hundreds of people. It's not just us. It's hundreds of people, and we're in the State Department group, this very small group of us who worked on the establishment of diplomatic relations. So me and all the others, xiao tu dou. So we're standing in a group, and I don't know what Carter and Deng said to each other, but suddenly, Deng comes over to us, and he wants to shake all of our hands, and so it's a group of maybe 10 of us. So he shakes all of them, and I didn't realize this was history. I just said, oh, I'm shaking. I'd shaken hands with lots of leaders as part of the State Department. I didn't realize that, but it was in retrospect quite extraordinary. And I guess what Deng had asked Carter is who did the work. He knew Carter didn't do the work, so Deng asked Carter, well, who did the work? And Carter knew. He says, this group over here. So Deng walked over and shook our hands. And but it just reinforced to me as I look back at that, the importance of the contact between the President of the United States and, the head of China. And in, over the years, hosting Jiang Zemin, hosting Hu Jintao, hosting Xi Jinping. It's so, so important that that contact occurs and that the President of the United States hears directly from people from China and the President of China, and the President of China hears directly from the President of the United States and Americans. So, President Xi has seen Bill Gates, he's seen Henry Kissinger. It's important that he sees more Americans so he can hear directly. And his focus on people to people. So in all of his speeches, he said, we must reestablish people to people contact. And that is absolutely right. We must. If the people to people, what happened during COVID is the people to people relationship stopped. When I went to China in March of this year, I hadn't been there in 3 years, there were no non-Chinese. I'd go to breakfast, I was the only non-Chinese. I'd walk on the streets and people would go, oh, 有一个外国人. 我们很久没有看到一个外国人. I mean, that's what was going on. So, long answer, sorry. I'll try to be briefer.
Thank you. And on the table today are also our graduate students of the Research Hub. So they're sort of younger generations of China, and they were most of them were born after 1995, actually. So this 95后 post 95. So I think they might have a question as well. Yeah, Feng Fei. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Orlins, for sharing with us your
mic.
Thank you, Mr. Orlins, for sharing with us your most interesting personal experience, most vividly, if I may say so. And you talk about building a constructive relationship between the U.S. and China, but what we see that under the current circumstances, actually the U.S. and China relations is actually facing many difficulties, especially with the United States imposing sanctions on Chinese enterprises and individuals continuously. So in this case, I wonder, what do you think? What kind of wisdom is required, in order to clear these obstacles to a steady development of our relationship? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we think about that a lot. So how do we kind of stop the slippery slope down increased deterioration? One is, I think, occurring, that we need to start talking to each other. The other is what's happened over the last few years is we've seen an increased securitization of the relationship. So everything has become national security. Mm-hmm. On the Chinese side, whether it's data restrictions, whether it's investment restrictions, whether, there's been a securitization. On the U.S. side, the same. Everything is national security. Well, that's not healthy, because ultimately, when you restrict these technologies, when you restrict these goods, it creates an inefficiency in the world economy that hurts people and pricing and is inflationary. So if China needs to research the same stuff as America, and we don't do it jointly, whether it's on biotech, whether it's on green energy, it effectively, we don't know precisely, it doubles the cost. So that means the ultimate result costs much more. It is inflationary and it is inefficient. So what the two countries need to do, and maybe President Xi and President Biden can begin this, is agree on a definition of national security. So we need, I understand America needs to protect its national security and China needs to protect its national security. Okay, I'm fine with that. That's okay. But we need a definition of what is national security and what is effectively whitelisted. So what we can kind of continue to sell, we can continue to export, we continue to jointly research. So whether it's biotech, so I am troubled when we begin to restrict biotech, because ultimately, or we begin to restrict pharma. You know, we can't jointly reduce this. I had a conversation, you know, my sister takes a cancer drug that was developed in China. I couldn't care less where that cancer drug was developed. I want my sister to get better. That there would even be consideration that this kind of joint research can't be done is to me very disturbing, because that has an effect on my life. So when we talk about AI and restricting cooperation on AI, okay, if there is AI weaponry, use of AI in launching of nuclear weapons or something, okay, let's restrict it, let's talk about it. But on so many things, we need to agree that this is not okay and this is okay. That what's happening now is both countries are slipping towards defining everything as national security. So it's really important, and it's especially important, you know, in climate change and in renewable energies. You know, China is doing a good job in this sector. Well, let's not restrict what they can do in the United States, what they can sell in the United States, what they can produce in the United States. That's all important. So what, you know, we now have these working groups between MOFCOM, the Department of Commerce. So maybe what we can begin to see is what I call, what I made reference to before, is white lists. So lists of things which are fine. Then we should create restricted lists, lists of things which we're not going to be able to sell. And then we should have gray lists where we're going to have to talk about whether we're going to allow those or not. And that would be, to me, a very constructive way to approach the problem. Because as you know, for your generation, we really need to deal with this problem, because if we don't, we're going to spiral down this dark place where too many things are restricted, costs are duplicated, innovation is restricted, and inflation is increased.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Orlins. So probably I have a question about public diplomacy, because among the exchanges between China and the United States, people-to-people exchange has always been a very key part. So over 50 years ago, the National Committee on United States and China Relations participated in organizing the historic visit of the Chinese table tennis team, the American table tennis team to China, which led to the famous ping pong diplomacy and the normalization eventually of the China-U.S. relations. So how do you think such public diplomacy activities as ping pong diplomacy can play a role under the current circumstances of China-U.S. relationship? And does the National Committee have any plan in that regard in this year and next couple of years?
Well, that goes right to our history, right to the center of our history. So when we hosted the Chinese ping pong team in 1972, you have to, and it's important that people understand that history. So in 1971, when the American ping pong team came to China, in 1972, when we hosted the Chinese ping pong team, U.S.-China relations didn't exist. You know, Americans were capitalist bandits, and, you know, Chinese were you know, the Chinese Communist Party was, you know, just helping the Vietnamese kill Americans. It was just the worst. And the polemic. So we may think the polemic today is bad. It's nothing compared to what it was in 1971, 72. It was really terrible. So what the brilliance of, you know, Zhou Enlai, Mao, Nixon, Kissinger, was to use this to change the public perception in China of the United States and in the United States of China. And it really worked. So when we hosted the Chinese ping pong team, so the Chinese, we had charter flights, and you have to, so there was a charter flight with the Chinese ping pong team. There was a second charter flight for the media. That there was so much media attention on this that we literally needed a second plane to do it. And it had a remarkable impact on U.S. perceptions of China. And over the years, what has happened is the people-to-people relationship between China and the United States has become the foundation of the political relationship. That the brilliance, if you're a political leader and you do something which doesn't have the people-to-people foundation, you're going to fail. You won't have the political support to do what you need to do. So the brilliance of our leaders in the 70s is they knew that, and then it continued, and then we had business, and then we had students, and now we have hundreds of thousands of students, and before COVID, we had millions of tourists, and we had all these cultural exchanges, and you know, we had an NBA star in Yao Ming in the United States, and we had, you know, Michael Jordan becoming a hero in China, and all of these, I mean, it just, the two peoples really pulled together. And what COVID did is it pulled us apart. We had no flights, we had no contact. Americans left China, Chinese left America, and that foundation eroded. And and the president of China understands that. So when he met with Gates and he talked about the importance of people to people, he got it 100% right. He was 100% right. That if that foundation is not there, then the leaders can't really accomplish what they want to accomplish because there's resistance from the people. So we really need stronger people-to-people ties. So you will have so I get to meet, I have the privilege of meeting with U.S. government and Chinese government leaders. What do you think the first issue I raise is? People guess what the first issue I raise is. What do you think it is? It's flights. It's the absence of direct flights between the United States and China, because it takes me 24 hours to get to Beijing. The first time I went to Beijing, it took me 24 hours to get to Beijing. Now it takes me 24 hours to get to Beijing. I will do it because it's my job and it's my love. I will do it. But most Americans, most Chinese go, so, and it's very expensive. Yeah, 很贵. So it's the most important issue, and the governments understand it. So we're seeing an increase in flights to Hong Kong. We're seeing an increase of flights to the mainland, and the agreement is to go to 48 by December 31, and my hope is we can get an agreement to go to 96 by June 30th. But don't forget, we had 340 before COVID between the mainland and the United States. So it's important. We'll be doing a big people-to-people conference on October, in 2 weeks, when I'm back in New York, which will celebrate the people-to-people relationship between the United States and China. We will announce it very, very soon, and you will see a list of Chinese who have, and Americans who have benefited from the people-to-people relationship.
Thank you, Mr. Orlins. Probably I will give the next chance to graduate students as well. Yeah. Yeah, it's okay. It's on.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Orlins, for your great sharing and your answers. So I have a question. So we observed that in the past few years, there have been concerns about the resurgence of mechanism in the United States. So we see that some Chinese students or Chinese scientists and even Chinese Americans, right, have been accused of engaging in espionage activities. And we see that a number of Chinese scientists have faced unwarranted investigations, and we see Chinese high-tech companies such as Huawei have unfair suppression from the U.S. And we even see that many Chinese scholars, they can't get their visa and be permitted for entering the United States. So what are your views on all of the things and this trend in the United States? Thank you.
I was in very strong opposition, and it was publicly stated, to what was called the China Initiative. I believe it did far more harm than good. The Biden administration, or not the Biden, the Department of Justice finally dropped that initiative, which I think is good. The U.S. government needs to assure Chinese Americans, Chinese scientists, and others that they can continue to do their work unaffected by these kinds of investigations. Similarly, though, the Chinese government needs to make sure that visas are granted and people are not prevented from leaving China if they do something. So again, you have this case where both governments have been going, in my view, in the wrong direction. And it's important that we both kind of go in the right direction. The sanctioning of Chinese entities, corporations, individuals, needs to be reevaluated in view of what I hope is this new definition of national security. So we have this bilateral definition of national security, which then says, okay, this sanction is okay, but this one we really shouldn't have. I think it's going to be very difficult politically to undo many of these sanctions. I think it's important that the U.S. establish clear rules for how you get what I call unsanctioned. So if you've been sanctioned, okay, then you, the sanctioned company, need to understand, well, why was I sanctioned and how can I get off that list? So that is an important part. I think China, for its part, needs to be very transparent about what data restrictions are, very transparent about when a foreign company violates Chinese rules with respect to, for instance, due diligence. So there have been examples of U.S. companies in China who have been raided and their phones and computers seized based upon doing diligence in China. Well, China needs and wants FDI, foreign direct investment. We've heard that, but that was my business for many years. I need to do diligence in order to decide whether I want to make that investment. Those kinds of restrictions are detrimental to allowing FDI to increase. It's really important that we see, what we've seen is a drop-off in U.S. FDI in China and Chinese FDI in the United States. From my perspective, that is not good. Partly because after I left the State Department, my first job was helping U.S. companies invest in China. So I was living in Beijing and helping. And those investments, they were good investments, but more than the economic return was the people-to-people return. You know, I always say that, you know, trading is like dating. You know, you trade, you date, you go home, you decide, do I want to date somebody else, or do I want to continue with this person? Investment is marriage. You invest, you are married. You can't decide, oh, well, I'm not going to do this anymore. You got to work like a marriage. You need to work on it, and you need to have it work. So investment is so important. You know, one of the deeply moving events of my career, really, I was so moved. So my brother, you know, we shared a room for most of till we were 18, and then he went and joined the U.S. military, and I went off to university. And he then, when he left the military, he went to Dayton, Ohio. Dayton, Ohio is a little different from New York City, to say the least. So I got to see Dayton, Ohio through his eyes. So through my brother's eyes, I watched this Midwestern city. I watched a company called National Cash Register close. I watched General Motors close. I watched the city get hollowed out. And then a number of years ago, a fellow by the name of Cao Duan invited me to Dayton to speak at the opening of a company called Fuyao Boli, Meiguo Fuyao Boli, Fuyao Glass of America. And suddenly my brother's community, which was dying, was reborn. So they hired 1,500 people, but more than that, the cafes and the dry cleaners and the shopping malls all reopened because these people were getting salaries. And I watched my brother's community reborn. And my brother, who had never been to China in his life and never understood what I did, I could hear him say, oh, I finally understand why you do what you do. And you helped my community be reborn. So investment is so important. But that's too long an answer to your question. But.
Thank you, Mr. Orlins. So probably I will ask a question about President Xi Jinping's visit to the United States in 2015. We remember that at that time you accompanied President Xi to attend the welcome dinner jointly hosted by the government of Washington State and also other friendly organizations of the United States. President Xi Jinping also delivered a very important speech at that event. So could you say something about your impression of President Xi Jinping as a world leader?
It was a great speech. It was just a great speech. And I was so pleased that U.S. media covered the speech. And I think it's really important because, again, it's the U.S. people don't really understand. They don't understand China, and they don't understand the president of China. And in that speech, he talked about who he was, he talked about his own experience, he talked about his own life, and he talked about the China dream. So he talked about his experience during the Cultural Revolution, when for 6 months he didn't get meat. Well, an American, I mean, it's such an interesting concept for an American that for 6 months you can't eat meat, and this is now the head of China, and it kind of allowed Americans to understand the historical trajectory of China through the leader's experience. So that's so important. I joked with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs then. I said, I can give 1,000 speeches and I won't have the effect of this one speech, because it was so kind of moving to an American audience that they can understand. Americans are not going to agree with the policies of the Chinese government. But to the extent that they can understand from where they come, that's extremely important. And my hope, first of all, I hope that he comes to the United States in November. Second, I hope that when he comes, he gives a similar speech, because it's important that all Americans, not only the Americans who were in the room in Seattle that night, but all Americans kind of understand from where he comes, that experience. You know, I teach all the people who work for me, you should understand who you're dealing with, not what their position is today. That's not sufficient. So all of your graduate students, when you go to a meeting with somebody, you understand what their background, where they came from, what they experienced as a youth, what they experienced in their early career, because that forms the way they think about life. So, you know, when I think, I think about my experience as a youth, and I realize that formed the way I think about things today. That in fact, by the time I was 22, my view of the world was more or less fixed, and that everything since then, over the next 50 years, it has fit in to that framework. And obviously, in my case, and then Len was America's involvement in the war in Vietnam. That had an enormous impact on my thinking. That when I'm in college and a friend dies in Vietnam, and I need to understand why I have lost that friend. Why? And when I can't understand that, when I can't understand the justification for us being involved in that war, it affects the way I think about America's policy. And as more friends died, and as I got more involved in the protest against the war in Vietnam, it still affects the way I think about American policy today. I love the American government. I love the American people. They took my family in when we were refugees. So I'm a first-generation American. And my parents told me throughout, you have an obligation to serve the American people and to serve the American government, because but for them, but for the American government and the American people, you would have never been born. We would have died. So when you combine that with this experience of the American government doing this government that my parents taught me saved our lives when they did something which was wrong, the war in Vietnam, I needed to find a way as a 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old to reconcile those views. So when people understand that about me, they understand, when they meet with me, they understand better who I am. So I tell everyone that when you meet with a Chinese official, understand what their background is. And when you meet, whether it's John Lee or Eric Chan or anyone, understand what their background is, because you may not agree with them, but you will understand from why they're making these decisions.
Thank you. Probably I will give the next opportunity to our graduate students as well, who have.
Well,
yeah.
May I ask another question,
Yeah.
Mr. Orlins? Well, since you are talking about the China policy of the United States, would you say that today's China policy of the United States, that is the comprehensive containment of China, is kind of a misjudgment in strategy?
Well, I don't agree that the U.S. policy is comprehensive containment.
Mm-hmm. So what is it?
I don't, not even close. You know, we don't want, you know, we want to de-risk. We need to de-risk. We do not want to be selling, whether it's technology or goods, to the PLA, which will allow them to threaten Taiwan or threaten the United States in the Indo-Pacific. And the rules that the Biden administration have put in, which I don't entirely agree with, but the theory, the intellectual foundation of those rules is we don't want to arm the PLA to then fight with us, and that Taiwan remains an issue, the East China Sea remains an issue, the South China Sea remains an issue, so we need to be careful. Where my disagreement then creeps in is we have expanded the definition of what would go to the PLA too broadly, and that we restrict too much goods export, too much technology export, too much investment. Now we're beginning to have minor restrictions on capital flows, and I think that's the mistake, but they are not intended as a comprehensive containment. And again, going to your question, we should be careful that we don't overly restrict Chinese students of science to go to, STEM students to go to the United States, but we don't want Chinese students who are then going to go back and work in, PLA-affiliated universities or think tanks or others to use that science to create effectively weaponry and other things that confront the United States. So that's where they need to draw the line. That's where the United States government needs to draw the line, but it is not comprehensive containment.
Thank you. So I have a question still about the meetings between the heads of the two states. So as we understand, meetings between the heads of states are of great significance in avoiding conflicts and managing differences between China and the United States. It plays an indispensable role. So as the president of NCUSCR, so do you have any expectations for the next summit meeting if it takes place between the heads of the states of China and the United States? And what is the implication for the world today?
Well, if it occurs, it will be very positive. That again, the need, what we've seen is the increase in talking, in cabinet level discussions between the United States and China, and that's positive. I think it's a strong positive for stability in the world. You know, they will talk about everything. I think it's a strong positive for the American and Chinese people, that we can see anything from economic progress to Senator Schumer raised the potential to restrict the export of precursors to fentanyl. So lots of Americans die from overdosing on fentanyl, and you know the precursors are the elements of the fentanyl come from China. The trouble is they have other uses, so they're legal. So what Senator Schumer hopes and others hope is that China can work with the United States. Law enforcement authorities in both countries can work with the United States to restrict that, which will save American lives. So if we can do that, Americans, so the public that has this, what I talked about earlier, this 82% negative view of China, they say, hey, wait a minute, China is making something illegal, which used to be legal, to save American lives? Isn't that good? So it's like, it has this very positive implication for U.S.-China relations. Because I think it begins to move the American people to having a more positive view of China. So I hope that if the meeting occurs, that they do that.
Okay, so we have a full house today, so I still see our grad students standing there. So probably we can give a chance to our students standing there. Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lee. Thank you, Mr. Lee. I would like to ask a question about international matter. So, in light of the war between Israel and Palestine, I would be interested in your thoughts on how China and the United States may collaborate to contribute to the peace in the region. Are there specific areas where you see potential cooperation?
So how can the United States and China cooperate in
Yeah.
the Middle East?
I think it's Senator Schumer discussed this with the Chinese leadership. I discussed it in my meetings. This horrific slaughter by Hamas, just a slaughter. I mean, just horrifying. You know, women, children, babies. I mean, it just is horrific. China's initial statement on this horrific event was far too neutral. You know, I was somewhat surprised because China, as a national policy, is very anti-terrorism. China is afraid of terrorism and takes very strong stands against terrorism. I was surprised at the lack of condemnation of Hamas. The second statement was better. It talked about civilian casualties, and obviously the civilian casualties at that point were all Israelis and Americans and others, not Hamas. So it improved. I'm concerned about China wanting to be neutral in this because as you see, the U.S. is very united in its stand against Hamas. And President Biden will, I think it's announced, will go to Israel. Is it announced now?
Yes, this morning, yes, announced.
So it was announced this morning.
Israel this Wednesday.
Yeah, so he's going Wednesday. So obviously the United States takes it very, very seriously and is appalled by the slaughter. China has begun to play a more constructive role in the Mideast. You know, its brokering of the establishment of relations between Saudi and Iran was very welcome. And it has the opportunity with the United States to play a constructive role in seeing if we can create a more peaceful situation in the Mideast. It's important that China work with the United States here. Obviously, we now have two aircraft carrier groups in the region. We're deeply worried about escalation. So China, it's one of those things where it was not predicted, but China can now use this to kind of improve its relationship with the United States, and that would be great. The Chinese leadership needs to understand how strongly the American people feel about this. There's a lot of partisanship in the United States, but not on this issue. As you can see, every Republican, every Democrat supports Israel in its stand against this slaughter, and for historical reasons, because of the Holocaust, because of the slaughter of 6 million Jews, 80 years ago. People take it. There's a terrible historical resonance in this. The slaughter of Jewish women, children, babies, and I'm not sure if the Chinese government understands that. It's really horrific that when you read the stories, I assume they've been published in Hong Kong the way they were published in, this was horrific. And the instruction, so now they have the instruction to the Hamas terrorists, they've gotten those papers, just kill as many people as you can. Just kill as many people as you can. Does the Chinese government really not want to condemn that clearly? I understand China's need for neutrality on these issues, but this is really just, wow. It's just horrifying. And, I hope that the United States and China can work together towards some kind of stability and peace in the Mideast, but I'm deeply worried about the next few weeks.
Yeah. So if I remember it correctly, I think the Chinese Foreign Ministry has already issued a statement to condemn violations of international law of all forms. So I think that's probably as a Chinese people, as myself, we always don't like violation of international laws of all kinds, and we are sort of kind of a stability force for the international order. So
but I think that the problem with a statement like that, so Hamas is committed to wiping out Jews, wiping out Israel. So Israel is now, and Hamas uses civilians as shields. So the question Israel, and President Biden will discuss this with Prime Minister Netanyahu, so what's Israel supposed to do? Sit on its hands and allow this slaughter? Or try and wipe out the Hamas leadership, which is committed to their destruction? So China's saying, well, this if you kill civilians in war, that's a violation of international law, the law of warfare. But the problem is that Hamas using civilians as shields is also a violation. But these are not equal violations. I mean, Hamas did this. So I find it difficult to condemn Israel when they have had their women, children, and babies slaughtered by Hamas.
Probably we can change to the event in Beijing today, the Third Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation. It's being held in Beijing today. So, how do you think of China's Belt and Road Initiative? Once you talked in an interview that you also wish the United States might have the high-speed railway. So do you still have such expectations today? And how do you see the possibility of the United States, will it or will not it, participate in the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, you know, this summer, so I now have grandchildren. I have 4 grandchildren, and I spent the last part of the summer with them on the beach in the United States, and you know, we'd walk on the beach, and they're very, you know, like every grandfather, you think they're the most brilliant children in the world. Every grandfather has the same view that your grandchildren are the most brilliant. So I'm walking with my granddaughter on the beach, and she says to me, it's just ocean, you can see nothing else. She says, "What's there?" And I say, "Europe." And she says, "Well, Lao Ye, you swim every day." I say, "Yes." "Can you swim there?" And I say, "No, it's a little far." And she says, "Would you like to? Do you ever dream of swimming?" I said, "Yes, that would be great." And she said, "Well, what happens if you can't realize your dreams, Lao Ye?" So I said, "Yeah, you know, you keep working towards them, but you realize that it's probably not going to happen." So you're quite right. You have researched my speech as well. I used to dream that I love the Chinese high-speed rail system. It's great. I mean, it's just great. It allows me to do things that I can't do because it's so consistent. It's so on time that, you know, I can be in a place and I know I have to be at the airport in 90 minutes, and you know that you will get there in 90 minutes and you will make your flight, and it's just terrific. This grandchild and my daughter live in Baltimore. Now, do people know the geography? So from New York to Baltimore, if it were China, it would take 30 minutes. In the United States, it takes 2 hours and 45 minutes if the train works on time, which is not very often. So I used to say, I want to have dinner with them on Sunday night and then get back to New York for work. And I had that dream because the Chinese could build a high-speed rail between New York and Washington, which would have a stop in Baltimore. But it's sadly not going to happen. The U.S. has passed a law. So when the executive branch makes a decision, you have some chance to overturn it. But when the legislation is passed, then it's really hard. So we can't, Chinese companies, including Zhonghe, China Rail, can't bid on U.S. transportation projects anymore, which is tragic. And I've recognized I won't be able to overturn that in my lifetime. So I'm sad. I won't get that dream realized, but it is the way it is. BRI. The U.S. should change its policy on BRI and find ways and places outside of China where the U.S. and China can cooperate. So and with U.S. companies, so whether it's General Electric on providing a turbine, or Caterpillar providing the earth-moving equipment, or Citibank providing the funding. We should find ways in third countries, so all the BRI summit is literally occurring at this moment as we speak here. We, the two governments, should find ways with private industry to work together in some of these BRI countries to kind of do things which help the countries. You know, one of the a point I've made, but it seems to get lost, is terrorism. So terrorists are bred in areas of poverty. And you always have to remember that, because if you can create economic development in a place, now it doesn't reduce it tomorrow, but over time, it reduces poverty, reduces terrorism. So the reduction of poverty reduces terrorism. It's not the only factor, but it is a factor. So if the U.S. and China can cooperate in these countries which need more poverty alleviation, it helps in the reduction of terrorism. But, you know, I used to say that all the time, but now people seem to have lost sight of that fact. So I think, you know, it won't be next year, but maybe in the future we can see a reevaluation of BRI and more cooperation in BRI countries with the United States.
Thank you. Next question. You have, okay.
So I have a relevant question, actually. So we've all heard about the trade war and then the decoupling of the two countries. So I think this is a hot topic, right? And I think recently we see that a lot of individuals on multiple occasions says, okay, the U.S. is not seeking a comprehensive economic decoupling from China. So that's what they say. But we still see a continuous increase in the U.S. restrictions on the economic and trade relations with China, particularly in the area of technology, as we mentioned. So how do you perceive the challenges and the prospects of the U.S.-China economic and trade relationships?
You know, I think China is now reaching out very much to kind of improve the environment for foreign direct investment. So, you know, I've met with a series of Chinese officials, all of whom say if there are problems with, you know, foreign direct investment, please raise them with us and we will make an attempt to fix it. So I think we're moving in the right direction in that regard. I think with respect to, you know, decoupling, it's not decoupling. It's, you know, I think as President Biden and Secretary Blinken and Raimondo said, it's de-risking. So it's not being dependent on any individual supplier. And then it gets back to the point I made in response to one of the earlier questions, which is we need a definition of national security, which prevents this broadening of the definition. That, you know, if we just keep saying, well, this is national security, you know, somebody said, you know, electric batteries are national security. I said, really? Why? I don't understand that. So I don't, you know, green energy is national security? Really? Where? So it gets back to we need a definition, and then we need a whitelist. So if there are areas, so if we make a decision, if the U.S. government, you know, I get, people say, well, they say to me, you don't think we should protect our national security. That's totally untrue. And but China should protect its national security, and the United States should protect its national security. But we need to decide what falls within that protection. Jake Sullivan, talks about a small garden and a high wall. I agree. I agree with that, but let's see how small the garden should be. So let's come up with a definition, and we need the definition in every industry. When people in the United States or in China talk about biotech as an area of national security, I get a little worried because, you know, that's the future for my grandchildren. Are the United States and China going to be able to come up with ways to make sure they're healthy, make sure they have good lives, make sure Lao Ye lives to a good old age? You know, that's really important. And I worry that we're losing sight of that. So my hope is that these meetings, these upcoming meetings, and then there'll be these upcoming meetings, and then I hope there'll be meetings then after that. Because when we talk, it's better. You know, we've seen a slight breakthrough in the military to military. So after the Pelosi visit, mill-to-mill contact between the United States and China got cut off. That's dangerous. That's not good. But now we've seen the Ministry of National Defense invite a U.S. representative to the Xiangshan Forum. That's public, right? I think that better be public. That's public. And that's good. That's good. So we'll see some U.S. official come and meet with the Ministry of National Defense, meet with the PLA, but then we need to create regular mechanisms for the U.S. military and the Chinese military to talk to each other so we don't make a mistake.
Thank you, Mr. Orlins. I really did a lot of research about your remarks. So you once said that America's anti-China policy or America's China policy has been a disaster for average Americans, and also it's a disaster for U.S.-China relationship. So this fact seems more than obvious, but often overlooked in the public discussion in the United States. So could you elaborate more on this view, or in your opinion, why this kind of China policy being a disaster for average American is often overlooked by the American public?
Well, you know, I think the Chinese government's policy towards the United States has been a disaster for average Chinese, too. So, media, please don't, you know, make sure you report both sides of my comments, because if you report on only one side, that's not great. You know, I think both governments have adopted policies which punish ordinary citizens. What I talk about is lower income Americans and Chinese. So take as an example the tariffs. So President Trump's administration imposed these tariffs, and then China retaliated, and then the United States added more tariffs, and that's it. So we estimate that those tariffs cost the average American family about $1,000 US a year. If you're rich, if you're making $500,000 $1 million, you don't even notice the $1,000 a year you have to pay. You don't even see it. It's like, whatever. You know, doesn't matter. If you're making $25,000 a year, and you have to pay an extra $1,000 for shirts and pants and socks and shoes, you have to figure out, where do I cut back? Where do I reduce my expenditures because of those additional expenditures? So they are severely punished. In addition, the military tension between the United States and China has caused allocation by both the central government of China and the U.S. government of additional military expenditures. So both the United States and China are spending more on their military than they would be if there weren't those tensions. Okay, where does that money come from? Who provides that money? The answer is it comes from, in China, poverty alleviation assistance, education, social programs. In the United States, it comes from Medicaid, which is for poor people, education subsidies, which is for lower income Americans, food stamps, other things which are for lower income Americans. So if you look at this, you see that the biggest loser in this intense competition is lower income Americans. So, and lower income Chinese. So that's what I mean when I talk about who is losing this.
Thank you. So as for the public opinion on China-U.S. relationship in the United States, my colleague also told me they might have a question. So please.
Thank you, Mr. Orlins, for your generosity of speaking
Can you
from
turn on the mic? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Orlins, for your generosity of speaking from your own experience. I really appreciate that. And I also did a little bit of research of your former speech. So in the past and also today, you have expressed hope and vision for China and the U.S. cooperate on issues such as dealing with climate change and healthcare, which largely benefit the common interests of humanity. However, according to the Pew Research Center survey conducted in March 2023, over 50% of American adults actually reckon that the U.S. and China cannot cooperate on these issues. So why do you think that is? And also, how much does this public opinion matter when it comes to these collaborations?
Public opinion matters a lot. It matters in China, it matters in the United States. It's difficult for politicians to go against public opinion. Again, it gets to the whole foundation of the political relationship is people to people, and that's public opinion. I think COVID and the absence of people-to-people relations has deeply affected the image of America in China and of China in America. That the absence of kind of seeing people, it's easy to demonize when you don't see somebody. If I have dinner with you, it's unlikely I'm going to demonize your views of the United States or if you're American, your views of China. And that has had a large effect. I think we need to work hard to educate Chinese about America better and Americans about China better. One of the reasons, I don't know if you saw it, but I did a 1-hour interview with Ambassador Burns Thursday morning, Beijing time, Thursday morning, Thursday evening in the United States, which we distributed throughout the United States. And the attempt was to educate Americans about China. And it also, Phoenix, I believe, distributed it in China, unedited, which I think is very good. So, it means we need to educate, because the idea that the United States and China shouldn't cooperate on health care, the truth be told, is ridiculous. I mean, it's just one of the reasons that the pandemic was so destructive. Not the sole reason, but one of the reasons was the United States and China had stopped cooperating on health care. We used to have Americans working in China's CDC. we had a huge presence in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing relating to healthcare, and it got reduced during the Trump administration, and that had a real effect on our ability to restrict, to have dealt with the pandemic. So we need to educate better, and I take that, you know, your point that it just means I have to work harder and see if we can educate. You know, our job is to educate. You know, it's to educate. It's to bring facts to the table. And if, yeah, the Pew poll, I did an interview with the person who conducted that poll. It's you know, it's troubling.
Okay, so thank you very much, Mr. Orlins. I think we have a full house today again. So the success of the event of our RHSA also depends on the participation of many of our audiences and friends and fellows. So probably we can open up the floor for probably 2 questions from the audience. Yeah, please, the lady.
Hello, I'm a reporter from Finnish TV. I want to ask a question about ever since environmental economic growth faces many challenges, including the continuous rerun cycle, and geopolitics. And in your point of view, what global economic growth opportunities will China's third Belt and Road Forum bring?
With respect to climate change?
I think in the context of the continuous rate rise cycle and very
Continued what?
rates rise,
Oh,
rates rise
yeah.
cycle, and very complex geopolitics.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully, it looks like American inflation is getting under control, or is under control. So I think the rate rise cycle is hopefully over. We may see no more rate rises, or maybe we'll see one more rate rise. I think that BRI should be used as a platform to work in part with the United States in third countries. So again, these areas where the U.S. wants to provide aid and China wants to provide aid through BRI, we should find ways to cooperate. That if China wants to build a dam and have water power, well, that's good. The United States should find a way to have its industries or its financial services companies work with China and not start with a negative predisposition. We're not going to do that because it's BRI. That's not wise. That there are areas where the United States and China can cooperate to do these things in countries where we have coinciding, not conflicting interests. You know, it's often, you know, as I said before, to the extent that we can alleviate poverty, the United States and China can alleviate poverty, it reduces the risk of terrorism. Terrorists are bred in poverty. If people have middle income lives, it's unlikely that they're going to become terrorists. So I think, you know, the U.S. should be more receptive to cooperating with third countries.
Yeah, please.
I want to ask some questions about Hong Kong and the United States relationship. As you mentioned that the APEC is going to take place in the U.S. next month, but the chief executive of Hong Kong, John Lee, is still on the sanction list of the United States, and maybe that's the reason that why he's still not invited to attend the APEC. What do you think about the sanctions? How is this affecting the relationship of Hong Kong and the United States? And do you think the United States should lift the sanctions of Hong Kong officials, especially John Lee?
Can you tell us your affiliation?
I'm from Now TV.
Now TV.
You know, the sanctions issue is difficult. I think politically, given the polling in the United States, it's extremely difficult to reverse that. That the politics of it are very difficult. I think Hong Kong will benefit from the improvement in U.S.-China relations. I think there are a lot of issues that remain outstanding in the U.S. government's view of Hong Kong. I think the Hong Kong government needs to resolve those with respect to, incidents that now occurred more than 3 years ago. These need to be made history, not be kind of going forward, but they need to be in the rearview mirror, in effect, and that would be productive. But I think the politics of 2024 will make any meaningful progress difficult.
Okay, so
just one last question, and then I gotta go anyhow.
So you just mentioned it's important to bring people from both countries together. So do you have specific actions you suggestion you want to the government or Hong Kong government to do to bring people together?
The Hong Kong government or the mainland government?
Yeah, both. Suggest for.
Well, for the.
So your affiliation, please?
Yeah, suggest.
No, I mean your affiliation.
Oh,
yeah, organization.
News, sorry.
Yeah.
Local news.
Oh, sure, I've got lots of suggestions. First one is flights. We need to increase flights. Hong Kong needs to increase flights. I saw Lufthansa is now going back to pre-COVID levels, but we still need many, many more flights. 48 by December 31 is insufficient. We need to go to hundreds. The appetite, the cost is astronomical. I mean, it's so expensive. I guess I can't say because we're in, but my budget has difficulty because of the cost of flights. We sent a few delegations to China this summer, and the costs were very, very high. So flights, most of it. Visa issuance, the Chinese government has simplified the visa application, so we need to do that. We need to make sure there are Americans who arrive in China and are denied entry even though they have visas. There are Chinese who arrive in the United States and are denied entry even though they have visas. That needs to end. That really is very destructive. I continue to hope that the consulate in Houston and the consulate in Chengdu will be reopened. I think their closure was a mistake, a historical mistake. I think the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the State Department, even though they won't say so publicly, agree with me that that should have never helped. I think Hong Kong officials, when they go to the United States, should speak to the American public. If they go for a technical meeting, normally they would go and just return to the United States. I think, return to Hong Kong. I think it's important that they now speak directly to the American public. I think there's, people have kind of lost sight of the two systems part of the one country. If you ask Americans, they all say it's just one country now, and the two systems don't exist. I was telling, well, I won't say who I was telling an official, I said, the two systems was clear. If so I was in Beijing, and I'm not sure why, I had great difficulty with my VPN this trip. So a lot of times, and needless to say, I need information instantaneous. I mean, my job requires that I know from unfiltered, uncensored, that I know what's going on. And Heine and I had a lot of VPN difficulty. I arrive in Hong Kong, no difficulty. It's fine. Everything is, it's fine. No problems.
Hong Kong UVPN works very well.
I don't need a VPN in Hong Kong. I don't use it.
We use Hong Kong UVPN in Beijing. It works just perfect.
Oh, it works perfectly. Well, I had problems, and I mentioned it to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I said, my VPNs, I'm having trouble. And they said, well, maybe it was because I stayed at a different hotel, but the, that brings home the two systems, part of the one country, two systems, and, the independent judiciary and other things. And what Hong Kong needs to do is, when talking to America, emphasize the two systems. I understand why Hong Kong needs to focus on the one country. But when you're in the United States, it's the two systems that need the focus, because then we won't have the problems that we have in U.S.-Hong Kong relations. But it's, I think people understand that. And again, as I said earlier, I think Hong Kong will begin to benefit from the improvements in U.S.-China relations.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Orlins. So I think our seminar will conclude now. Let me express our thanks to you again for your time and sharing. Thank you very much. So I hope next time we can have a bigger room for you.
This is a packed room.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah.
Oh, great.